Greetings to all. This is Tendai Dumbuchena, host of the podcast Crisis in Africa. Welcome to episode 10. There was outrage expressed by some on social media about the treatment of African leaders at the funeral of the late British monarch Queen Elizabeth II 2 weeks ago. African leaders were allegedly bundled into a bus to attend funeral service while Joe Biden, the President of the United States, traveled in his limousine called the Beast. Presumably, leaders of other countries deemed more important than Africa's used their preferred mode of transport. In the absence of an official account of what actually happened, the truth is hard to establish. There has been no official complaints by African leaders which suggests that they had no objections to being transported by bus. The recurrent theme of this podcast is that perceptions of Africans will continue to be negative as long as the continent remains the weakest and poorest in the world. The clarion call on this podcast is for Africans to develop and strengthen their continent to the point of being a significant player on the global stage. Powerful countries derive their strength from two sources, the economy and the military. On both counts, African countries are weak. With 17% of the world's population, Africa only contributes 3% to global economic output. There is not a single African country which registers high on the list of the world's most powerful defense forces. To fathom how the real world works, it has to be viewed through the prism of power and capacity. Sovereign nations are not equal as proclaimed in the United Nations Charter. It is a fallacy. In nations as in societies, there is a hierarchy of power and status. The world has over generations changed for the better, with a greater capacity for nations to coexist in relative peace. That the powerful prey on the weak has always been a feature of human existence. The Athenian historian Thucydides wrote in the 5th century BC that, open quote, "the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must," end of quote. This profound observation was as valid then as it is now. Following the horrors of the Second World War, a new rules-based international order was created to prevent destructive wars. The United Nations was established in 1945 to be the custodian of this new international order. But some realities have not changed. Those nations with economic and military power have a bigger say in what happens in this world. The United Nations is controlled by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, namely the United States of America, United Kingdom, France, Russian Federation, and the People's Republic of China. All are nuclear powers, and crucially, each have a veto to block any resolution they are opposed to. All 5 permanent members, with the exception of the Russian Federation, are among the 10 wealthiest nations in the world. They are all on the list of the 10 strongest militaries in the world. The United States, Japan, China, France, Canada, United Kingdom, and Germany have a combined shareholder control of both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They lead the top 20 countries that contribute 84% of the budget of the United Nations. Since the formation of the IMF and World Bank in 1944, a convention that still exists today reserves the position of managing director of the IMF to a European citizen and that of president of the World Bank to an American citizen. This is expected to change soon, but underscores the extent to which power on the global stage is concentrated in the hands of a few countries. It is a measure of how far Africa is behind, in that none of its countries feature anywhere close to those with economic, military, and diplomatic clout. To make matters worse, Africa is unable to fund its own institutions. The African Union and its 8 regional economic communities depend on external donors to fund their programs. The security situation in many parts of the continent is bad, with governments unable to protect their citizens against insurgents. Somalia, Ethiopia, countries in the Sahel region, Sudan, Nigeria are some of the countries where governments, even with foreign assistance, are battling to establish law and order. Many countries like Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, and some in the Sahel region face famine as a result of drought and, until recently, the unavailability of grain and fertilizer from Ukraine and Russia. Failure to utilize abundant arable land in Africa is also a major contributory factor to food insecurity. The continent is in a crisis, but its political leadership is in denial. There is nothing to indicate a realization that, in the absence of serious interventions to uplift Africa from the basement, its people will continue to suffer what they must. In 1978, China realized it was in crisis. Its economy was backward, unable to yield decent livelihoods for its huge population. The country's new leader, Deng Xiaoping, introduced radical economic reforms that over 4 decades catapulted China to the economic, military, and technological superpower it is today. It is an example that should inspire Africa. I thank you. Listeners, do you agree that Africa is in crisis? If it is, what should be done? Do you have confidence in the current crop of leaders? Please post your comments below.